Hello, everyone. Today is part 2 of how to maximize investor interest. So without further ado, let's dive right in. My name is Shuo Chen. I am a former founder, now investing in founders and teaching founders at Berkeley and Stanford. I'm also a board member here at Decode, the largest tech and entrepreneurship community co-hosted between Berkeley and Stanford. And last week, we covered one of our most commonly asked founder questions around how to maximize investor interest. And today is part 2 of that. So if you're interested in checking out part 1, please check out the links linked below. But today, I want to dive right into the top 3 tactics to help you maximize investor interest. So tip 1, you really want to keep your round as competitive and selective as possible. And in order to do that, you want to signal a packed schedule. So convey to investors you're chatting with that you have hard stops and you have to reschedule if you need an additional meeting. You also want to hint at interest without naming specific names. So you could mention things like you have travel plans to San Francisco City or New York, or at a specific time to signal the kind of partner meetings that you're about to get into. And typically you want to mention Monday because Mondays are typically when investment committees happen at some of these large funds. And you want to mention that you have interest so people want to continue to follow along and push forward and see that you have momentum. But you also don't want to name specific names because typically the investor community is very small and everybody knows each other, and you wouldn't necessarily want people trading notes before you've already closed investors. And of course, in this process, you want to incentivize early commitments as much as possible. In fact, you could even offer small discounts for very small first tranche of investors that are raised or commitments that are made by a certain date, or if they're just some of your earliest anchor investors into this round. And so you can communicate, hey, we want to get this round closed as quickly as possible so we can get back to building. So if you're able to commit within the next week, then we're hoping that you'd be able to do, that we would love to offer a small discount. And then, of course, you want to signal that you have a selective round and you want to limit the number of active investor conversations you're having. Perhaps don't have anything more than a handful of single-digit conversations. You definitely don't want to mention anything like I'm talking to 50 other investors because that damages your credibility and could actually be worse than saying nothing at all, because you want to make sure to communicate that it's not only a selective round, but you've also been really thoughtful about personalizing outreach only to the individuals that are most relevant to you. So with that, that leads us directly into tactic number 2, which is convincing each investor that they're the favorite. So we talked about how you want to indicate that this is a selective round and you're not talking to too many people and how that outreach is personalized. Well, for each investor conversation you have, you want to make sure why you've thought through why this particular individual is the perfect fit. You want to highlight things like their past experiences, their strength, how they're different than any other investor. And of course, out of the past track record that they've managed to build, what are the most relevant parts to what you're building now? And you definitely want to emphasize their very specific value add. So we know you can make a difference in our business given your background in X and how you've helped Y start up with Z. So you want to be as specific as possible. And of course, you want to do reference checks with founders that they've backed in the past. And you want to mention the specific stories that you've heard from those founders that make this investor particularly relevant for you. That shows to the investor that you're very thoughtful. You've done your due diligence in talking to other founders that they've worked with. And that also gives them a good excuse to reach out to those founders that you've spoken to and ask them for feedback. So of course, keep in mind that you're not only asking other founders for reference checks on the investor, but you're also hoping that those other peer founders can be helpful to you in providing a helpful reference when, the investor is doing back checks on you to these other founders. And of course, during this whole process, you want to downplay money and valuation as a decision-making factor because anybody who's here is in it for the long run and you want this to be a long-term partnership. And that brings us to tactic 3, which is you want to run a tight timeline as you're putting together this term sheet process. You want to make sure next steps are very clear after every meeting, whether you're sending follow-ups or the investor has follow-ups, what the specific deadline or timeline for that would be. You want to set an exact due date for when the investor must get back to you, either with a term sheet or give you a firm yes or no of some sort. And you want to use that timeline to push back against any attempts to rush or delay decisions too much. So you're having a full opportunity to consider all the offers on the table. And generally speaking, you want to allow about 3 to 4 weeks between the final meeting you have with the investor and the deadline of the term sheet. So there's enough time for an internal process for any additional due diligence and for investment committees, et cetera. But typically from the first meeting to that final meeting, you want to keep in mind that you have multiple touch points before the investor that you're speaking to presumably would be comfortable enough to start to run this more seriously through their internal processes. So just keep that timeline in mind. And of course, you want to schedule conversations so that all the term sheets arrive at around the same time for efficient evaluation. You certainly wouldn't want one timesheet to already be on your table and then all the other term sheets not yet to have arrived. And so you're faced with a situation where you either accept this term sheet or you risk losing this term sheet altogether. But of course, just keep in mind, any term sheet is good to have. So if you do happen to receive one term sheet before you get anything else, you want to leverage the existing term sheet you've received, that offer that you have from the existing investor, to then communicate to all of the other investors you're chatting with to say, hey, I already have received a term sheet. And so that actually accelerates our timeline, and we would like to hear back from you within the next week. So those are some of our top tactics for maximizing investor interest, part 2. And of course, if you want to hear any other top covered questions that we have from our founders, please feel free to follow us, like, comment, and subscribe for more content from Decode. With that, thank you, and we'll see you next week. Bye.